PlayStation Now launched into a public beta a couple weeks ago, but calling it a beta might be a bit of an exaggeration. You can lay down real money on this thing, which means they're not just testing out the tech that streams these games, but they're also testing out their pricing model. That is to say that one of the whole points of this beta is to see just how high they can jack these prices while still remaining viable. For those who don't know, PlayStation Now is Sony's way of addressing the backwards compatibility problem of the PS4. In previous console generations, you could plop in old games and roll like a 50% chance of it working, but that's because it's a feature that Sony has gradually phased out of the PS3, which gives them opportunities to capitalize on the loss of this feature. That's where PlayStation Now comes in, as a game streaming service, where you watch a video of yourself playing games on other people's hardware. That's how they're currently offering PS3 games on the PS4, with PS1 and 2 games being conspicuously absent. The feature is in what they call a beta, despite offering a few lucrative pricing tiers, so they're working out the kinks on time funded by purchases people are making on it right now. And I just want to say that those people need to be extremely careful about what they're buying. I'm not the only one apprehensive about this stuff. Reception has not been positive. Other people have said that PlayStation Now is too expensive, too complicated, they've called it a joke, whatever, but I think that's all kind of underplayed criticism. Because I think it's worse. Streaming games as a concept is something that scares the shit out of me. I saw a sentence like this, which, while even criticizing PlayStation Now, made the dangerous assumption that streaming may be the ideal way to play a game, period, and that sounds like hell to me. It sounds like an eternity of suffering and damnation. It hurts for me to imagine a world where streaming becomes the de facto normal default way of selling video games, and here's why. When your entire game installation is hosted remotely, you really have no control over what happens to it. There's no possibility of the user accessing or altering the files the game's made out of, and there's no conceptualization of the game being a hard physical product in front of your screen. There's no swapping out memory cards or controller ports in that situation. There's no modding, no homebrewing scene, no first-person GTA 5 or Project M or homebrew emulators if the game's data is stored on a secure server remotely. Because of network latency, inputs and outputs have to deal with a delay. Video quality suffers and controls feel slow. Higher level competitive play isn't possible through streaming. Games, as you know and love them, are not designed and have never been designed to account for input lag in single-player modes. Dante Must Die and Revengeance mode are no longer viable options. Faster-paced, twitchy games would be impossible to play, and because of bandwidth caps, bills would be impossible to pay. Game streaming services are not yet truly popular. OnLive introduced us to the concept shortly before confusing pricing options and low demand nearly tanked the company, but PlayStation Now makes this stuff available on multiple mainstream gaming consoles. It could become popular through this service, and if streaming does become the mainstream, then it threatens one of the last bastions of long-term consumer value that games have always had. Even when you purchase a digital copy of a game, there is still some version of that game obtained on a hard physical storage device that you own. When you buy a physical copy of a game, you have it for your entire life. This gives them long-term value. There is inherently more value in physical media than digital. Digital does have some exclusive consumer value thanks to the convenience of downloads, but you are ultimately purchasing much less product in comparison. There is a whole lot less paper and plastic being sacrificed to make a digital copy than a physical one. The value of their convenience is dwarfed by their much lower production costs, where distribution, packaging, and publishing are much cheaper. These savings should, and usually are, passed on to the consumer. But even then, you still have the possibility of cracking a kind of backup from the game you downloaded, and I'm pretty sure this is against every terms of service agreement out there, but people do it, and that ultimately means we're not totally subjected to the whims of the distributor. But you don't even have that small, unofficial amount of consumer protection when streaming. There is literally no better situation that a game publisher could ever find themselves in. They are totally in control of the product when you are playing a game streaming from their computers. And what really scares the shit out of me is that they could use this feature to be in control of this industry's history. I have a feeling that someone big is going to try and make a push to normalize game streaming soon, to try and make it the default way of releasing games. Imagine that Killzone 6 releases in 2019, and Sony claims it's too graphically advanced to run on the PlayStation 4, and that the most cost-effective way of getting it to consumers would be to exclusively deliver it through streaming. For the following 5 years or so, while the service remains profitable, that wouldn't be too great of an inconvenience. But what about 40 years from then? Without any hard copy of that game, without any kind of artifact to leave behind, we might not be able to remember it unless Sony allows us to remember it. And by the way things are looking right now, they might not even be around then. You can still order a Magnavox Odyssey from eBay. They were mass-produced. They don't need to survive as museum installations. Independent collectors and reviewers can buy them and share their memory with the rest of us, but when there's no hard copy of a game left behind, how are people in the future supposed to archive them? There is no guarantee or even an assurance that today's game streaming services will remain active in the long term. And remember, in the grand scheme of things, nothing lasts forever. Streaming exists only to solve immediate problems of inconvenience and hardware inadequacies that are only going to look petty later on. But for now, streaming is how publishers can kill piracy by being completely in possession of both the software and the end user's experience with that software. It's how they can gouge prices and capitalize off of missing legacy features by selling them back to consumers in subscriptions with digital goods that they can turn off and on whenever they please. Streaming is how publishers can charge people to play video games by the hour, by supplying games by the hour. Right now, there is a 4-hour rental option for games on PlayStation Now. They're selling rentals, like how Blockbuster used to do, instead of the presumably permanent access to games you get on their own PlayStation Network store. In fact, if you compare prices between the two, it is usually cheaper to buy the games on the PSN store rather than rent them on PlayStation Now. The incentive to rent, the sole reason justifying that inflated cost, the only pro to all of those cons, is convenience. It is because these old games won't work on newer hardware, and that makes this solution a compromise. People are decrying the pricing scheme right now. They're criticizing the convoluted tiers of options and times and prices differing between different games, and they're right to do that. They're also criticizing the tech, with frequent complaints citing input lag, and one admittedly very unscientific Polygon poll claims that 40% of their readers weren't able to get it working at all. But even if they fix those problems, even if they reduce the prices, I am still incredibly skeptical towards the idea of this kind of program ever truly being a good thing. But even the critics seem attracted to the idea of using PlayStation Now as an inexpensive monthly subscription service or as a bargain bin for dirt cheap rentals of older games, and that might not sound so bad right now, but giving it that kind of support early on could enable horrible abuses of this system later on down the road. There are terribly greedy companies out there who would love to reify all these negative implications that I'm seeing happening with this technology. And as PS3 games become more obsolete, as more people finally pack that console up and put it away, the value of the convenience of streaming those games is going to increase. And so, while that happens, I encourage you all to be extremely careful and extremely critical about buying games this way, because this is not how games were meant to be played.
Yeah, this is a little weird, specifically the look.
Yeah.
If there's any latency on your right stick movement, it starts feeling a little bit like.
Already, I noticed that the latency from my motions on the controller to what appears on screen is very noticeable.
But it was just enough off to screw you up.
This is a big problem because first-person shooters rely on twitch movements.
This does get so twitch heavy, I could see that mattering.
For a twitch-based multiplayer game, the response time on the controller is just too much.
If you're into counting frames, you probably don't want to play fighting games this way.